The next thing we're going to do is actually create our world. And in order to create our world, we need to pass in three things. The first thing we need to pass in is a par3.avi object. And this basically defines the lower bounds and the upper bounds of your world. So this lets the engine know this is the area where you're going to have to simulate everything. The next thing you need to pass in is a gravity vector, which is basically a two-dimensional vector that lets the engine know which way gravity is pulling you. And the third thing you need to pass in is a Boolean variable that lets the engine know if objects should sleep or not. And what I mean by sleep is if a object is standing still, it's not colliding with anything, it's not doing anything, don't simulate it. Save some of that processing power. And usually you want to set that equal to true so your game or application runs a little smoother. So with that out of the way, let's get started. First thing first, let's create our par3.avi object. I'm going to call mine world box. Alrighty, and then we're going to set the lower and upper bounds of this using this object. And now that we're here, it's a good point to point out that in Box2D, the flash port, everything, and I think for the other ports, everything is measured in meters. And in this case, 1 meter equals 30 pixels. So you have to keep that in mind whenever you use measurements in Box2D. So in this case, when we set the lower and upper bound, we have to remember this is times 30. So another thing to remember is, since this is going to define where everything is simulated, you want this to be much bigger than you need it to be. This is just to be in a safe zone, and the reason being is if any of your objects go off the edge, they're just going to freeze. It'll make it'll look like your application is really glitchy or not, and it's not. It's just because you set some numbers wrong. So for this case, we're going to set the lower bound to -100 and -100 for the x and y coordinates. You want to remember that the lower bound is the top left. And this is because on the x-axis, the negative x is on the left, and on the y-axis, the negative y is on the top. So the edge with the two negative values is the top left. And remember, since 1 meter equals 30 pixels, this is actually the coordinate -3,000, comma -3,000. So that's going to give us a 6,000 by 6,000 area to work with once we set the upper bound. So let's go ahead and set the upper bound. And we're just going to set that to 100, 100, which basically is 3,000, 3,000. So that's about a 6,000 by 6,000 area to simulate everything. So that's pretty big, and we shouldn't get any problems with that. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is define gravity. And I'm going to call mine gravity. And we're going to use a b2vec2 object, which is basically a two-dimensional vector. And we're going to just keep it simple. We are going to set the x gravity, so we don't want gravity pulling toward the right or towards the left. We just want it to be 0. And we're going to set the y gravity, the y component of gravity, to 10. Remember, 1 meter equals 30 pixels. So this is actually at 300 pixels per second squared, if you want to get technical. So we're not actually going to see a big difference because we are making a static object on the canvas. But whenever you mess around with your games, you're probably just going to want to mess around with this number and see what works best for you. So the third and last thing to make our world is our sleep variable, and I'm just going to call it bsleep because it's a Boolean. And I'm just going to set this to true, and the reason being is, like I said before, if say you have a ball that's rolling around and it stops rolling and it's not hitting anything, if this variable is set to true, the engine will not simulate that, and it'll save some processing power. Else it will simulate it, and if you're having a lot of objects moving and some of them are standing still, that's just eating up on your processing power. So let's just go ahead and keep this in true, and my recommendation is always set it to true unless there's some special case that I'm not aware of. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our world. I'm just going to call it my world, and it's a b2 world object. And we got to pass in the 3 parameters, which is the 3 things we just made. So it's a world box we got to pass in. We're going to pass in our gravity, and we got to pass in our sleep variable. And that is it. We got our world. So if we actually run this, we shouldn't see anything, but we shouldn't get any errors. And hopefully that'll be pretty good. Alright, no errors. Alright, so we are good to go. Pretty good so far.